to walk in assured of our place in Christ, to walk in knowing that, as Jim Smith would say, I am one in whom Christ dwells and delights. I live in the strong and unshakable kingdom of God. The kingdom is not in trouble, and neither am I. And to walk into a room with that as my center of gravity, with Jesus as my North Star, knowing that I can walk in, I can befriend myself, and I don't have to be my own enemy in spaces where I might be questioning, do I belong here? And so I think that's something that is really important for me to remember as I walk into rooms.
Hello, and welcome to the Being Formed podcast. My name is Adam. I'm the host of this show. I started this podcast because of my background in pastoral ministry, as well as my current work as a soul care provider, spiritual director, transformational coach, writer, teacher, a retreat leader. You see, I love God and I love people, and I want to resource you not just with the good news about the availability of the kingdom of God here and now, but with practical ideas and tools that will help you step into the fullness of life with God on this side of heaven. So I started LifePoint Resources as a nonprofit ministry, along with my wife, Rebecca, to create a space, a community where you can come with your questions, doubts, fears, failures, hurts, and brokenness, curiosity and wonder, hope and anticipation, and everything else that makes you, you, and find more people just like you. You're not alone. One of the times in our lives where we often feel most alone is when we feel the need to make a hard decision, or a decision is made which dramatically affects us, which will surely cause a time of transition and even isolation, maybe feelings of betrayal and abandonment, or at the very least, a misunderstanding and disagreement around the decision and the underlying reasons for even making the decision in the first place. Well, you'd think we'd be experts in change and discernment by now, considering how much of our life is spent in transition from one thing to another. People change. The world changes. We change. Rooms change. And that's what our guest on today's podcast is here to talk about. Emily P. Freeman is the New York Times best-selling author of 6 books, including the one we'll talk about today, How to Walk Into a Room, The Art of Knowing When to Stay and When to Walk Away. Emily's book was published in 2024 to great fanfare, I might add, and it continues to resonate deeply. Emily is a phenomenal communicator, one of the very best. And it's an extreme honor to welcome Emily to the Being Formed podcast. So pull up a chair, have a seat at the table, and enjoy my conversation with Emily P. Freeman. Well, hello, Emily, and thank you so much for being willing to join the Being Formed podcast. It is great to meet you and see you here on Zoom and connect a little bit with you. I've been following your work for many years, and I'm just going to go ahead and say I am a fan. There's a lot of things about your writing and your spirit that I connect with, your story. So I'm so glad that you'd be willing to join us here, have a conversation on the Being Formed podcast. Thank you. How are you doing today?
I am so glad to be here. Thank you for having me. It's always a gift to talk with people about spiritual formation, about what's happening beneath the surface, and kind of have an opportunity to ask the questions beneath the questions. So I'm so happy to be here with you.
I love that you say that, because one of the first things that stood out in your book, How to Walk Into a Room, is that you, as a spiritual director, ask a lot of questions, and which means you are a great listening soul. We should have a wonderful conversation today, but we might just be asking each other lots of questions. We'll see how it goes. As I prepare just a little bit to move into this conversation about your book and about discernment and this idea of noticing when is it time to leave a space and walk into a space. These are some of the questions that you're addressing in your book. Before we do that, I'd like to ask you a question that goes a little bit deeper than that first one. Not just how are you, but how is it with your soul?
Well, you just start out light and easy, Adam. I do appreciate it. Just like the surface stuff, the weather, it's awesome. Um, you can't have a conversation in a vacuum. And so it can be good to maybe recognize the landscape of what's happening just in life right now in the world. I think a lot of us probably can relate with feeling like we have like headline whiplash of just the goings on of the day, can leave us feeling, if we're not careful, I think it can leave us feeling super discouraged, if not like there's no impact we can make in the world, sort of on a large scale when you look at what's going on, but also on a more micro family scale. We are entering into a new season of life, in that we just sent our youngest off to college. And so I've heard people, I know there's the whole empty nest piece of it. I've also heard people call it an open door season or an open nest season, because a lot of times those birds fly right back in. And so I think with all of that, the world goings on and the life goings on in the family, there's a lot of grief. There's a lot of joy. There's a lot of anticipation, about kind of what this next season holds for my husband, John, and I. He and I have been married 24 years now, almost 25. We've got some plans for our 25th anniversary. We look forward to that. But so there are things that we think we know, and then there are things that we just have no idea about. And so there's a kind of a colorful mix in there in my inner life of, embracing some joy and also some sorrow, recognizing that it's kind of the end of an era of parenting. But we're entering into a new one.
So this is your youngest. You have twins as well, correct?
We do.
And so 3 kids, and the nest is open.
Yeah.
And wow. Now, are your children nearby, far away?
We're the most spoiled of all. So we send our son off to school, but he's only about 15 minutes away. He is living on campus. So it does feel like, we haven't seen him since we left him there. And then the twins, one is in, about 2 hours away in Boone, North Carolina, and the other one's in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. So no one's too far. Everyone is in an in-state school. Thanks be unto the Lord. And so we're here in North Carolina enjoying that everyone is just a drive away.
Yeah. So in addition to being a New York Times bestselling author, many, many books, you're a spiritual director, Emily, and that's one of the things I'm so excited about. You're a podcast host, a retreat leader, sought after teacher, a residency lecturer. I'd love to hear your story, especially how you found your way into the world of spiritual formation. I'm very interested in that, spiritual direction, and this whole idea of offering soul space for others.
Well, when John and I were married, he was serving as a youth pastor at a local church and did that for about 12 years. So our first 12 years of marriage, he was a pastor for students. And about 12 years in, we discerned that it was time for him to kind of step into his next thing, but also for me to step into my next thing, which at the time, I think I was maybe on my 3rd book. And we realized that in order for me to kind of continue to do the work I was doing, I was going to need to maybe do a little bit of traveling. I had not really been doing that before. And he was also sensing kind of a move to really want to be home. And so it was during that time, it was maybe 2012, I want to say, he left his full-time work as a pastor and he came home to be with our kids. They were late elementary school at the time. And I also was home, but ended up doing a little bit more traveling than usual. But a couple things that I realized in that transition was the church that he had been pastoring at, it was an amicable leave. Nothing had gone wrong. It was just a sense of something different. But we did leave that church because mainly just to give the new guys some space, like John was a beloved youth pastor and these students were really sad that he left. And so, we thought, it probably makes sense for us to go someplace else just to let that new leader do his new leader thing. But what I realized was, one, the youth group leaders, the other volunteer leaders, were really kind of our church. Like those were the people we spent the most time with. And when he left that ministry position, he had all his goodbyes and all his like final things. But for me, I just sort of felt like it was just over, kind of bluntly over. Because yes, he left a job, but we also left a community. And this was, again, like I said, 2012. So that's one thing I realized. And then I also realized in the work that I was starting to do, a little bit more traveling, a little bit more work with writing books, which is more public than I had been, kind of just, doing the work that I had been doing at home. I started to sense a profound sense of like some loneliness, some exhaustion. I know Ruth Haley Barton talks in one of her books about that season for her, where she just was kind of running on empty in a way, and recognizing like, I need something more than what it is I'm finding or getting in the, kind of in both her outer life and her inner life. And so that was a time when I remember talking with a friend of mine. His name's Phil Anderson. He's a spiritual director, a writer, but a local friend here in Greensboro. And I was telling him about these things, kind of what I just told you. I'm feeling lonely. I'm feeling exhausted. This work is weird. It's weird to go to another town and talk, and then you leave and they don't know you. You don't know them. And anyway, and he said he knew this kind of work because he also wrote books. He said, it sounds like maybe you would benefit from a spiritual director. And he told me that, he was seeing a spiritual director, and that she was of a different, same faith. She's Christian, Protestant, but a different stream of faith than, than his own denomination. He found that to be really helpful, to go to someone who didn't speak his exact language.
Yeah.
So I ended up going to someone he recommended, and it was the first day of Lent, 2012, and it is now 2025, and I've been seeing her ever since.
Wow.
And it was during that time, and I look back and I think, bless her and my actual hearts, because I don't know what I was saying to her when I first got there, but I just have learned so much since then about like my own ways of seeing God, my own narratives I had of God, and what it means to be a Christian, and what it means to be a person, and what it means to grow with God. And I was probably like very looking for results when I went to see her. I was uncomfortable with silence. I was awkward in my own skin. And now here I am, this many years later, I can look back and say that was really, it was a continuation of something, but it was also the beginning of something, which was just this appreciation for being held and having space held for me that did not have an agenda, beyond letting me be exactly where I was and listening for what God was doing in the midst of that. And so that sort of was my entry into spiritual direction. And then several years later, it was actually 2016, I had thought about maybe I would like to learn more about actually offering direction. But it was then that I found a lot of, listen, Adam, so many programs for training in spiritual direction. But what I found in my research was maybe I actually wanted to broaden that a bit and learn about spiritual formation, because I saw sort of, as you're looking for spiritual direction programs, I also saw a lot of formation. And that's how I ended up at Friends University in 2017 to get my master's in spiritual formation, which also had training in spiritual direction, not to become a director, but they had some classes. And I thought maybe that would be a good way to know if that's really something that I would like to pursue, and something I would like to do in this kind of second half of life. So that's kind of how I ended up in that world.
Oh, that's great. For those who don't know, Friends University has a particular, I think, place in this spiritual formation. We want to call it like a modern movement or something like that. James Bryant Smith, working there for many, many years, correct? Is he part of the master's program? Like, did he help develop that, or?
He did. So he sort of teaches undergraduate students in their spiritual formation studies, and then they decided at the school with his input, to start a master's degree program, which he did start, but he was very smart and thought early on to hire someone to come in to develop it, to run it. And so that's how he found Dr. Keith Kiesler, who was my professor and is now my colleague there.
Yes.
And Keith Kiesler has sort of taken it and run and developed it. And we're entering into our 10th year in the master's program. And so, but Jim definitely has a hand, and he teaches every semester. In the residency, he comes and does a lecture there, and so it's always fun to see him again. But he's definitely key in that program, as well as the spiritual formation movement as a whole.
Yeah, in those early days when Dallas Willard and Richard Foster were hanging out with Jim or James Bryan Smith and Trevor Hudson and folks, Renovare was formed, and they were having some of their earliest conferences and things there, I think at Friends University even. And I think it was James Bryan Smith who kind of took the challenge from Willard to actually do something in terms of writing a curriculum for Christ-likeness, which is kind of the whole Good and Beautiful book series. Yeah. There's a lot of threads and a lot of cool things for people to explore. I love learning about all this and seeing how God, through His Spirit, wove it all together. And so I'm just so thankful that you're part of this really beautiful story that's unfolding, and how you've actually seen it unfold in your own life, and we're all grateful for that. Our show is called the Being Formed Podcast. And speaking of Dallas Willard, he says a lot that the main thing God gets out of your life is not the achievements you accomplish, or, the books you write, or the number of podcast episodes you have, or those who listen. He says it's the person you become. And so I love the idea that we're all being formed. The question isn't whether we're being formed or not, but who or what's forming us, and how are we being formed. And so how might our understanding and practice of discernment, a healthy version of that, form us more and more into Christ-likeness, Emily?
I'm glad you brought up Dallas, because that statement of his that we're always getting a spiritual formation, the question is what kind? Just like we're always getting an education, the question is what kind? It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of what kind. And also the idea of it's less about what we do, but it is about who we are becoming. And that statement has carried over into my work in discernment and decision-making, because I have found through, anecdotally, I'm not a researcher, but I think that the results would be the same if I were to do this in a scientific way, that when we have a decision to make, that we, just as a people, that decision, until it's made, it's just going to tap us on the shoulder, and it won't leave us alone. And different ones of us have different responses to that. Some of us put it off and put it off and put it off, and we procrastinate making it. Others of us make it too quickly just to get that discomfort of an unmade decision off our back already. And then we figure we'll just change something later if we regret the decision we made. But overall, I would say most people, no matter which type of decision maker you are, you want to make a good decision. You want to make a right decision. With the information that you have and what's in front of you, you want to do well by yourself, by the people around you, and by God. But what I have found to be comforting and also true, and this kind of echoes Dallas's words about spiritual formation, is that I think the same goes for decision-making, that it's actually not so much about the decisions we make, but it's about the person who I am becoming. And now that will inform the decisions I make, and that's not to say the decisions are unimportant. But I think sometimes I can get overwhelmingly fixated on this decision and what's the exact right thing to do, and I can get paralyzed or I can get overcome, and forgetting that what our friend Jesus, what God is actually most interested in is, who am I becoming on the inside? And are there ways in which, and I believe that there are, that the process of making that decision is actually the point, and maybe not even the end of goal of the decision itself, especially in these bigger decisions that take us longer to make. And so to answer your question, a long way around is, That process between where I stand before I have a decision to make, and eventually, no matter how long it takes, when I get to the point of making that decision, what happens in between there is spiritual formation.
Yeah.
We are being formed in that gap.
Yeah.
And that's where I basically live all my life and do all of my work is
Mhm.
I want to talk to people in that gap. And I want to help stand in that gap, whether it's as a spiritual director, whether it's as a creative coach, whatever role that I can possibly play, even if it's just a writer and a reflector, to help people become more reflective on their life, because
Yeah.
the best indicator of our future decisions are the decisions that we've already made. So what can we
Mhm.
learn from that? All with the eye on it, though, less about the final decision being
Mhm.
exactly right and more about who am I becoming? How am I
Mhm.
leaning on God in this? How am I bringing in the people in my life
Mhm.
and trusting, dare I say it, trusting myself enough to know that I too can hear the voice of God. And
Mhm.
how might that voice be shaping me into becoming someone today?
Yeah. Well, you say, dare I say it?
Yeah,
Like,
because Adam, I don't know about you, but I think a lot of us maybe grew up in traditions,
yeah.
Christian traditions, that whether it was said out loud or just implied, that we are really people who can't be trusted. That, they quote the verse, the heart is deceitful and wicked, and you can't put your trust in it. Um, but I would counter that with the New Testament theology of Christ has given us a new heart, and that Christ is in us, we have hope of glory. And if you look at the story of Jesus, he put a profound, some would argue, too much trust
Hmm.
in the disciples by leaving them sort of, when he, died and resurrected and, rose again. It's like, okay, but you're going to leave like the whole thing, the whole gospel with like these guys? Really?
Mhm.
Are we doing that?
Mhm.
But there was a profound amount of trust, not in their ability to be great, but in their willingness to trust God who is great.
Mhm.
And so I think we can also, turn in and do that on the inside, trusting that God is within me and God is powerful enough, loving enough, kind and intuitive enough to let me know what I need to know when I need to know it.
Mhm.
And can I turn my blind eye to that? Can I close my ears to that? Sure, but I think we are capable
Mhm.
of discerning that in the presence of God. And when we talk about this idea of desire, we can get really skittish and weird about it. But the reality is, guess what? What you want is what you want, whether or not you admit it.
Mhm.
But if we try to move forward in the world and act like we don't have desire, it's going to come out one way or the other. Unfortunately, if we're not willing to admit what it is,
Yeah.
it will come out sideways through frustration, through anger, through repressing things. And we won't, the whole point of becoming the person who I believe God is inviting us to become, it gets stunted when we're not willing to confess, admit, celebrate what our desire is.
Yeah.
And that is very different from demanding that desire be met. And I think
Mm.
sometimes when we say, like, oh, we talk about desire, no, that's selfish. No,
Mhm.
demanding your desire is met, that's what's selfish. But confessing it and saying, here's something I long for, it's deep, it feels deeply risky, but it can also be really holy to do
Yeah.
it that way.
So you'd think by now we would be experts in navigating change, and yet it's the
Yeah.
one thing nobody seems to really know how to do unless someone will help guide us and help us figure this out. And that's what we all seem to be longing for, is how to navigate change and transition and know that we know, or trust even if we don't know. And so this is the space. And then you say, and into this space, you also bring you. You bring you. And you have a story, you have experience, you have things you've heard from God, ways you've been present to God and God present to you. You bring all that intuition and that relation, that real relationship, lived experience with God into all of your conversations. I mean, I think that's one of those growth edges, not just for me, definitely for me, but I think for most of us,
Yeah.
especially if we have been raised in this culture and this church culture that has said, yeah, you can't trust your desires. You're supposed to die to self. And, we take that all the way to even your body is bad. I mean, we have
Yeah.
so many ways of misconstruing this idea. So I just wanted to say thank you for recognizing and bringing to the surface this idea that not only are we looking for God and God's spirit and God is with us and all this stuff, but we have this lived experience with God. And I think God is asking us sometimes to learn to trust our own sense of being with God and moving into this space from that healthy place, right? So there's a lot of work to be done. Like
Yeah.
Dallas would say, God's trying to get us to this place where he can empower us to do the things that we want. And then he goes, now don't misunderstand. I didn't say that wrong. I meant that. We can do the things we want, but our wanters have some work to be done. Like we got to work on our wanters. And so like that's it though. Like what if you could get to a place where you could trust that, I know there are probably some blind spots and some places where God is definitely still forming me, and I need other people and community to help point those out. But what God and I are doing, the conversation we're having together, is good.
Yeah, that's good.
So, first part of your book is about recognizing when you've been in a space you love, a space you helped create, or a space you just find yourself. You begin to notice that there's something happening. Maybe you need to be discerning. Am I supposed to stay in this space? Am I supposed to leave? This is the beginning of these big decision questions. And yet the questions we're asking ourselves a lot of the times is, how do we know? How do we know? Can I trust my instincts? Can I trust my inner self? Can I trust the voices I have coming in? What if I'm reading things wrong? What if I make decisions too rashly? That's me, by the way. I was the guy who could make a decision quickly and go, well, if it's not the right one, I'll deal with it later. And so I had to pay the price of relational disconnection.
Yeah.
And then we put on top of this pressure to make this decision a pressure of wanting to please God, which is it's a noble thing. It's a good thing, but it's all based on an understanding we have of God. Okay, so we bring all this into these questions, and so discernment becomes really hard. And yet we've been having to deal with change our whole life. So you come along and you bring this framework, Emily, of pray. And I'd love for you to just share briefly with us, because I'd love for people to read your book. But what is the pray posture?
Well, I'll just start and begin with, we mentioned James Bryan Smith earlier, and he talks so eloquently and so well about narratives, about the ideas we have about God, and how important those are when it comes to everything. But for this conversation, when it comes to making decisions, because how we see God is going to impact how we think God sees our decisions, right?
Yeah.
And I think it was A.W. Tozer who said, the most important thing about you is what you think about God. And I would also take that a step further and maybe add to it, if I could be so bold. Also, a most important thing about us is what God thinks about us.
Yes.
And so sometimes when I'm my own center of reference, it puts the pressure on. But when I, maybe flip that and think, perhaps God's view of me, knowing that it's one of love and one of being surrounded by safety and care, even if there's challenge and growth that's uncomfortable there.
Right.
But ultimately, the bedrock is love. And so from that place, I think having a framework to make decisions with, not it's hard to think when you're writing a book, it's like, okay, how can I communicate this in a way that's memorable, but doesn't feel like a formula? Because there's certainly not a formula to making decisions, because it's like, it's going to depend on who I am today and who tomorrow, and, so many things. But just for the sake of conversation, I have found this framework to be helpful. And it begins with, it's PRAY. The P stands for point and call. The R stands for remember your path. The A is acknowledge presence. And the Y is yield to the arrows. And I'm happy to talk through briefly what those kind of are and how they can help in decision making, if that would be helpful.
I would love it. First of all, the point and call, or the point and name, that was brilliant. Like just the way you brought it into the book and talked about, Is it in Japan where that's a very common, there's a term for that there, and it adds to efficiency, right? And so just that piece alone,
Yeah.
honestly, was worth, I think, the entire read. And so I'd love for you to just share even just a little bit about the point in the name.
Yeah, it's a practice I read about in maybe first in Atomic Habits, James Clear's book about habit stacking and making change. He is another person who talks about change and transformation, but when it comes to habits, but this idea that in Japan there is a safety system that was implemented called pointing and calling. And it is exactly what it sounds like. The railway workers were trained to use both their body and their voice to just point out things that were true. And it sounds almost ridiculous. That's how simple it was. But when a train comes into the station, the railway workers would point to the time of arrival, 12:15, and they would say it out loud, 12:15. When it was time for the train to go, they would point at the sign and they would say, go. When the signal said stop, and you see what I'm saying, it was just very embodied, almost like a toddler would do, like dog, ball, how toddlers they see what they see, they like it, they say it out loud, they move on. But what they found was, actual research found that this did reduce workplace error by 85%. So it really did make a difference just by people being embodied and paying attention.
Yeah.
And when we apply this to the discernment and decision-making work that we're talking about here, this is a vital first step. And that is that when we have a question like, is it time to quit my job? Is it time to leave my church? Is it time to break up with my girlfriend? Whatever the big question you're asking, oftentimes what we really want is, I'm asking the question, I would like an answer, please, and thank you. But what this framework, I hope, helps us to do is to slow down, to say, okay, first step, point and call. And there are a lot of questions we can ask ourselves. I offer 10 questions to ask yourself in the room you're questioning, to give yourself a way to point at what is true. Because a lot of times, what I've found in my own life and in talking with people is you say, I just need to quit my job. But as you start to point and call, you realize you actually love your job, but the commute is killing you. And you in your mind, it's like it's all the job. But when you start to point and call, what is true here? What do I love about this place? What is wearing me out? What is life draining? What is life giving? Where are the corners that I feel like I have an impact in? Where are the spaces that I don't have an impact? Who has already left this room? Who's walking in now? Who has the power here? When you go through these questions, I just rattled off, I don't know how many, you can start to parse out like, okay, what is the actual decision I'm trying to make? Because to me, it's, should I quit my job? But maybe it's, do I need to change my hours? Or do I need to ask for a hybrid opportunity where I can work 2 days from home? I don't know what the situation is, but I would say pointing and calling is only ever helpful. And maybe you'll end up at that exact same place.
Yeah.
The point in pointing and calling is not to make the decision. It's to help you know what the decision is that you're making. And so that's the first point in this framework.
Like you said, just that simple idea opens you up to at least 10 questions that are probably just the beginning of questions that could be asked within those, right? And so it's just so different than like a pro-con, right? Pro-con.
Yeah.
It's inviting you into all these layers of paying attention and noticing and naming and saying what is. And to me, that just reminds me of like, you have to know where you are before you know where you're trying to go, right? Like
That's right.
Yeah, and so this is helping us to do that. As we move through this framework, we also have to state that your book is really based on a metaphor of a house. And so that's where we get this idea of leaving a room and walking into other rooms. And so I loved when you talked about how I could be in the same room as you, and we could be in the room with a bunch of other people. And yet because of our stories and because of our scripts and so many other things, it's like we're not in the same room.
That's right.
Can you say a little bit about that?
Well, whenever I, part of my job at Friends University for the graduate students is our first residency when we're all in the physical room together. Part of my job, self-inflicted or self-appointed, is to kind of quote unquote get people in the room. And that's because we can all be in the same room, but that does not mean we are having the same experience.
Okay.
and we can share the space, but we don't necessarily share the story. Because every time when you walk into a room, you bring with you every story you've ever lived. You bring with you the people who offended you yesterday and the ideas you have about things you have to do when you get home and stories from your childhood that you might not even be aware of. And so when you walk into a room with other human people who have all that same stuff going on, and then you listen to a sermon or a lecture or have a conversation, or you hear some music, or you smell coffee, or you look at stained glass windows. Like, we all have different stories attached to all of those sensations. And that goes true for every room we ever walk into, every physical, literal room. We are all maybe in the same space, and someone can walk out and be like, that was amazing. I loved it. It reminded me of blah, blah. Someone else can be like, I'm never going in there again.
Yeah.
We all know what that feels like. And so when you take that idea into a metaphorical space, which is my favorite, please and thank you, and I'm so sorry, because some people are like, not metaphor people, which I have heard since I wrote this book. They're like, loved the framework, didn't get the metaphor. But for me, it's helpful to think about not only do we understand that experience physically when we walk in and have different experiences with groups of people, but we also can think about it in terms of, there are some rooms in my life, some communities, faith-based spaces, or groups or volunteer positions that, like, I feel like I was almost like born for or born into. Like, I've just been here since forever. It's a fit. You turn out the lights in this metaphorical room, I can walk around it 10 times and not even stub my toe once. Like, this is my place.
Yeah.
And we get what that feels like. And then there are other rooms where you're a visitor, you're new, you walk in and you're like, this isn't really for me, but whatever it is, whatever that room is, if it's a group or a commitment or a responsibility or anything. I think what this whole book and what this whole conversation really wants to speak to is what happens when you are either in, one of those rooms that you've been in since birth that just feel just right to you, or even, this is harder, a room that you worked really hard to get into. You went to school for it, you prayed for it, you longed for it, you wanted it, you told everyone about it, you finally got it, and here you are. And now years have gone by, and now things start to change, or you start to change, or the people around you are changing, or just the room is different. What do you do when a place where you once belonged maybe is becoming a place where you don't belong anymore? And how can we begin to navigate even considering walking out or making a change? Because now you're also dealing with a whole new set of narratives. And those narratives are, what narratives do I have about what it means to stay and to walk away?
That's right.
And a lot of us have really strong narratives about what it means to be, quote unquote, a quitter, or what it means to be someone who stays and sticks it out.
Yeah.
And it depends on your family of origin, your social location, where you live, where you come from, what those narratives are, because they're not the same for everyone. Some people have like sparkling ideas about starting new things all the time and leaving rooms, and like entrepreneurial spirit, that's a positive thing in their family or in their place of work. Other people, it's the opposite. And, it depends on even your cultural affiliations with what it means to stay or walk away. Sometimes it's like, oh, it is so honorable to stay in the same job for decades, and to even consider making a change would be like a disgrace to the family, or to, your character would be in question. And so the same action is walking out of the room, but the narrative is really different. So when we talk about this decision-making and discernment thing about staying or leaving in the rooms of our lives, there's a lot at stake, or at least there seems to be a lot at stake. And there's a lot happening, more than what we sometimes give it credit for, more than we can put on a pro-con list. Because a pro-con list assumes this is all math, everything weighs the same amount.
That's right.
The pros, the cons, we just look at it and then we make our choice. But we all know life doesn't really work that way.
Well, in the book, you are very open about a community that you and your husband were very much a part of forming from the very beginning. And I'm going to let our listeners engage with your book and your story there. So I'm not asking you to rehash that, but I do recognize that you can relate to a lot of people, Emily, myself included, who look around at the community, and largely I'm speaking of their community of faith, and this place that has held them, a place they would call home, where they don't feel like they've been stubbing their toes, and then something happens, something shifts, something significant happens. You talk in your book about proximity. And so, yeah, then all of a sudden we're facing this question that we never imagined we'd have to face. Do I belong? What happens if I don't belong here? And so, do you have any encouragement for those who are in the middle of discerning something similar in their own lives?
Well, first, I have a lot of compassion for it because I've been there, and I know, Adam, you have too. And so many people are there now or have been there recently or are about to walk into that experience.
Mm-hmm.
They might not even realize it yet. And so I have a lot of compassion that just to hear someone else say, I get it, and you're not alone, can go a really long way. I think I would also encourage people to remember that staying and leaving, though it can be devastating and heartbreaking, is also can be part of a healthy human rhythm of life, and that change is inevitable. And so knowing that very rarely in life, if you look over your own life, probably, can you point to a place that's just been as it is forever.
Mm-hmm.
And I think with hindsight, it's helped me to think about how much places and people really do change over time.
Mm-hmm.
It's more painful the more quickly it comes on, but even places that I've been in for a really long time, they're not the same as they were when I got there. Mm-hmm. And it gives me just a small amount of encouragement to know that even if we had stayed, for example, you mentioned us leaving our church, but I recognize, that was 5 years ago. Even if we had stayed, it's a very different place than it was when we left. Yeah. And so things would have changed anyway, even with us there. And I think so recognizing that, that is an inevitable part of life. Mm-hmm. But then finally, I think I would say in the same way that decisions, that it's really, the point is about the person who we are becoming. I think the same holds true in these really painful spaces where maybe we feel like we've been rejected or betrayed or left behind or left out, in places where we have walked out, but it feels like someone walked out on us, even though it looks like we're the ones who left, but it feels like we were the ones left. That there's so much companionship in our friend Jesus there, that there is a wide, long table in the kingdom of God that we are always invited to sit at. Yes. And that is one table that we will never be kicked out of or left out of or unwelcome. And so that has been, though it hasn't always felt true, I can look back over time and say, oh, but that always has been true.
Mm-hmm. I have so many more questions, and our time is rapidly coming to an end. Your book is not called How to Leave a Room. It's called How to Walk into a Room.
Yeah.
And we've just modeled probably what the majority of, I think, the conversation is about how to leave well. And that's because that's so present on everybody's mind. I guess asking you if you could talk about one part of the book that kind of gets often overlooked, what would it be?
That's a great question. I don't know if I've been asked that one yet. Well, you mentioned, the interesting paradox, maybe that's not the word, of it's called How to Walk into a Room, yet a lot of the conversation around it is about how to walk out. And there's a reason for that. We actually almost titled the book How to Walk Out of a Room, but that just left everybody feeling really sad. And I thought there is actually something we're walking towards, that there is always something new is always waiting. And so thinking about, yes, we ask the question about, should I stay, should I go? But ultimately you're going to walk into another room. Yeah. How do I do that? Well, it starts with leaving the last room well. Yeah. And leaving well is not, it's so many times we want to either burn all our bridges or avoid it. And I think there's a third way. But to kind of speak to that walking into a room, I talk about walking in as your own friend, walking in as a leader, even when you're not in charge. And I think that piece maybe is one that I don't talk about as much when I have conversations about the books. What does it mean to walk in to a room as the person who you are and not as the person who you think you ought to be.
Yeah.
That's easy to say. And I guess depending on your personality, maybe it's harder for some of us to do, to walk in assured of our place in Christ, to walk in knowing that, as Jim Smith would say, I am one in whom Christ dwells and delights. I live in the strong and unshakable kingdom of God. The kingdom is not in trouble, and neither am I. And to walk into a room with that as my center of gravity, with Jesus as my North Star, knowing that I can walk in, I can befriend myself, and I don't have to be my own enemy in spaces where I might be questioning, do I belong here? And so I think that's something that is really important for me to remember as I walk into rooms.
So Emily, before we leave and say goodbye, you're a person who's always creating, always listening, always living in this space with God of asking really beautiful questions. And so I'm wondering, what is your current growth edge right now? What does it look like for you? What are you seeing on the horizon that's got your attention, that you think might be forming something new, some new thoughts, some new curiosity? What's new for you these days?
Again, with the easy, lighthearted questions. No, I tell you what, I'm thinking a lot about spiritual practice. I'm thinking about how to engage spiritual practice in a way that feels and looks like me and reflects the heart of God. And what might it look like for me to live into walking with God in ways that are maybe even unconventional, and maybe don't seem quite as traditional, but are still sacred and authentic and connecting. So that's kind of got my attention these days.
Well, good. I'm so thankful for the way that you and God work together, listen together, communicate together, and then you offer the gifts of God for the people of God. Thank you very much, Emily, for being a courageous, authentic voice in our culture today. I just want to say, I think God's blessed your message, your ministry, in a way that it's getting out there. Obviously, New York Times bestseller. Your books are incredible. Your podcast is amazing. Yours is a voice, I think, that keeps pointing us, if we'll listen, back to our friend Jesus. So thank you so much for being with us. And we will direct people to your book and to your social media. And we just look forward to hearing more from you in the future. Thanks so much, Emily.
Thanks, Adam.
And thank you for listening to this conversation. I loved my time with Emily, and I hope you found it helpful, maybe even a conversation starter between you and your friend, Jesus. So if you want to keep up with Emily, and I hope you do, visit her website, emilypfreeman.com, and subscribe to her newsletter. Also, be sure to buy Emily's book wherever books are sold. It's very practical. You could even take it to your spiritual director and ask them to ask you the questions in her book. Go for it. Well, that about wraps it up. We have a lot more incredible guests coming your way on the Being Formed podcast, so I hope you'll stick around, listen to past episodes, share this episode with others, and continue with us on this transformational journey of being with Jesus and becoming people of love. These conversations are always with you at heart. So until next time, grace and peace.